hey, David, California's primary has been moved up by 3 months from June to March. What impact will this have specifically on the 2020 election, assuming that Donald Trump remains the Republican nominee for 2020? Okay, so yes, March 3rd, 2020, I believe, is the new date of the primary in California. If Trump is the Republican nominee, the primary in California really is going to matter only insofar as who wins the Democratic primary. You still will have Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina having their primaries before March 3rd, which is the date California will have their primary, along with a bunch of other states: Alabama, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, Vermont, and Virginia. So a few different things to keep in mind. Number one, California does have a history of moving around their primary, even though recently it has been in June. In 2008, the California primary was in February. They've had it at different times over the last several election cycles. The impact could actually be significant for a few different reasons. Number one, if you win big in California on March 3rd, that can have much more of a momentum setting impact than it would have to have California determine the result of their primary in June. So California could play a much bigger role in determining who the Democratic nominee and ultimate challenger to Donald Trump is going to be. That's number one. Number two, remember that California allocates delegates proportionally. So if you get a plurality of the California primary vote with, say, it's a five-way primary with 34%, you don't get all of California's delegates. You get 34% roughly of those delegates, or as closely as they can be sort of sliced up. So although there is importance to California moving their primary up because of that momentum setting agenda, on the other hand, remember that unless you overwhelmingly win California, it's not likely to be the deciding factor in who ultimately is the Democratic nominee. You've still got to do really well in the subsequent primaries. In particular, in 2020, there are two primary ways, that the California primary being in March could impact the presidential campaign in general. Number one, if Kamala Harris runs, senator from California, there's a case to be made that if we assume she would do particularly well in her home state, that having an early California primary is good for her specifically. That may not ultimately be the case because California, as a major Democratic fundraising stronghold could be good for establishment Democrats with more name recognition. It could be good for a more progressive candidate like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, although not all of California is that progressive. So I don't know. But potentially, if Kamala Harris is a candidate, that could be an important factor for California having an earlier primary. The bigger picture, though, is that it's going to be really tough to unseat Donald Trump. I mean, in general, it's just hard to defeat incumbent presidents. We've talked about this before. George W. Bush is a recent example, with everything going wrong and a failed war in Iraq, still unable to be defeated, although we could say it came down to foul play in Ohio and 140,000 votes. But that being said, it was close enough that made a difference. So having a much longer period of time, having 8 full months, if indeed we know who the Democratic nominee is going to be by the middle of March, which we may not as a result of this, that gives a full 8 months to have one candidate running against Donald Trump. Is that better? Probably. It's also a longer period of time during which that candidate can make errors, during which that candidate can be successfully smeared. But that is an important dynamic for unseating an incumbent president, particularly one like Donald Trump, who is appealing to people not on the basis of what he's actually doing, but on the basis of basically weaponizing disinformation, calling anybody who disagrees with you fake news, citing accomplishments that aren't real, like congratulating troops for a pay raise this week that is imaginary. So those are a few of the thoughts I have about California moving their primary up. I do want to hear from you. What do you think the effect will be of a 3-month earlier California primary?